Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Michael Barsanti, the Edwin Wolfe II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and I am delighted that you have joined us tonight for this wonderful joint presentation, and grateful to the American Philosophical Society again for partnering with us and for hosting this event. Tonight's event began with an article in the New York Times back in February by Ralph Blumenthal, where he wrote about told a thrilling tale of academic detective work, object study, archival research, and scientific analysis. And the former, or I should say, Director Emeritus of the Library Company, John Van Horn, who's with us tonight, wrote to me the day the article appeared and said this would make a really great program if Carol would agree and come to talk. So I followed John's suggestion, and 5 months later, here we are. It is a great pleasure to be partnering with the American Philosophical Society again, and as I said, we're grateful to them for hosting this event. And I am grateful to Bob Hauser and the staff at APS for being so helpful and for helping us and extending this invitation to their membership as well as to ours. Back in 2019, the Department of State's Office of Cultural Heritage commissioned a study to research the provenance of a portrait of George Washington that was hanging in the Paris residence of the American ambassador to France since the 1980s. Art historian Carol Soltis was enlisted for her experience with the work of Charles Willson Peale, and conservator Emily MacDonald-Korth for her expertise in authenticating paintings using scientific methods. Tonight, APS has also installed several items from their Peale collection in these cases right here at the front of the auditorium. At the end of the talk, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them, you have your own special small exhibition curated here for you, and I would urge you to come up and see them. They're really fascinating pieces. So again, thank you to the APS staff for that. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. I mentioned Carol Eaton Soltis. Carol is the Project Associate Curator in the Department of American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She is also a Trustee Emeritus of the Library Company of Philadelphia, which is how I first came to know her. Carol has her doctorate in the history of art from the University of Pennsylvania, and as author of the first scholarly catalog and exhibition on Rembrandt Peale, A Life in the Arts, published by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She joined the Smithsonian's Peale Family Papers project, where she assembled a catalog raisonné of Rembrandt's work and co-curated the National Portrait Gallery's exhibition, Rembrandt Peale 1778-1860 in Pursuit of Fame. Carol's most recent book, The Art of the Peales, Adaptations and Innovations, was published by Yale University Press and is an in-depth catalog of the Philadelphia Museum of Art's unparalleled Peale collection, which contains oil portraits, watercolor and ivory miniatures, still life pictures, landscapes, drawings, and prints by 15 different Peale artists spanning the 1770s into the 20th century. Among her numerous articles, those devoted to the Peales have included Yarrow Mahmoud and the Charles Willson Peale Portrait of 1819, published in The Muslim World, and Annapolis, Charles Willson Peale's Touchstone in the Wider World, for the exhibition catalog Ambition, Charles Willson Peale in Annapolis, as well as The Peales in the White House, America's First Family of Artists, for the White House Quarterly. Carol also co-curated and co-authored the exhibition and catalog Thomas Sully Painted Performance, the catalog published by the Milwaukee Art Museum and the Yale University Press. It was the first major exhibition of Sully's work in 30 years and examined his portraiture in the context of his lifelong interest in the theater. Carol is presently a member of the digital database project Reconstructing Philadelphia's Earliest Museums, 1774 to 1827, led by Dr. John Van Horn, Emeritus Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. Their project will document the contents of the museums of Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière and Charles Willson Peale, and is hosted by the American Philosophical Society. Emily MacDonald-Korth is a professionally trained art conservator and a specialist in the scientific analysis of paintings. She received her MS from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation with a certificate in the conservation of paintings. After several years at the Getty Conservation Institute, she founded Longevity Art Preservation, a laboratory for the forensic analysis of art, acquired Western Center for the Conservation of Fine Arts, or WCCFA, a paintings conservation laboratory serving the Western states, and invented Art Preservation Index, a patented stability rating system for fine art. Emily has worked on paintings and built heritage from old masters and new, including portraits of George Washington by Charles Willson Peale and Gilbert Stuart. Her discovery of Jean-Michel Basquiat's colorless UV fluorescent technique led to a University of Delaware-based Basquiat and Warhol technical research project. Emily is also a prolific public speaker and educator and has been featured in numerous media outlets. She is currently the president and chief conservator scientist at Longevity Art Preservation in Miami and WCCFA outside Denver. Please join me in welcoming Carol and Emily to the stage. Are you coming up? Oh, we're starting with the video. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Please join me in welcoming a video to the stage.
The Department of State has over 250 culturally significant properties around the world, as well as over 16,000 heritage assets located within diplomatic facilities at over 200 diplomatic posts around the world. The Office of Cultural Heritage was established in 2015, essentially to conduct a stewardship program for the care of the Department of State's culturally significant properties and heritage assets.
As stewards of these objects, we have a role to conserve them, so the conservation, but we now have an expanding role to communicate about them and to educate people.
Despite the diversity of the Department of State's heritage collection, we don't actually have very many paintings in the collection. There is, however, one very prominent painting. It hangs in the ambassador's residence in Paris. It is a full-length portrait of George Washington after the Battle of Princeton, attributed to Charles Willson Peale. This painting was introduced to me by my colleagues at the Office of Cultural Heritage. It had been identified as a priority for conservation, and some preliminary research had been conducted about its history and provenance. The Paris portrait was donated by Caroline Ryan Folk in 1989 following her death in 1987. Mrs. Folk refers to the painting as the Lawrence Albemarle portrait, yet we didn't have sufficient documentation in our records to confirm that it was in fact that picture.
And we learned that it had an exceptional story. And I think one of the key things that really led us to realize how important this project is that the portrait that we think we have had actually been out of the academic eye for over 60 years. And if we could help scholars, Peale scholars, and art history scholars to know more, and also just to know that this portrait is in good hands and is being properly cared for, I mean, that would be a win-win right there.
There was tremendous enthusiasm from the art historical community, specifically about the possibility that it could be the Lawrence Albemarle portrait. Knowing that the painting required conservation, the Office of Cultural Heritage wanted to embark on a study in advance of that to inform treatment. I was in search of a Peale scholar, as well as a conservator with expertise in authentication.
I first became involved in this project through a phone call from Lauren Hall, who said to me, most surprisingly, "Would you like to go to Paris to look at a picture?" I thought it was a joke. Provenance is really critical here. because the picture sort of had a disappearing life. Success is putting the two pieces together of the beginning of the story and the end of the story. The end of the story is it's coming to the embassy here in Paris. And I decided that what I needed to do was construct a timeline and put down what I knew. And so this timeline turned into something that was constantly edited. It was commissioned by Henry Lawrence. It leaves Philadelphia in 1780 with Henry Lawrence, who is going to the Netherlands to raise money. So this picture is taken by Henry, who probably commissions it privately, but decides to take it as a diplomatic gift to the Netherlands. So we have a terminus date of when it's on the ship leaving Philadelphia. So that's the beginning of its sort of life. Then it goes, starting across the Atlantic, it gets captured by British Captain Keppel, who takes it to his country estate in London. So George Washington has been captured. And Henry Lawrence, too, was captured. He was taken to the Tower of London and locked up for a while. I had to follow this in the 20th century, so I'm dealing with an 18th century painting's life in the 20th century. The Paris portrait that had been seized by Keppel earlier and taken to the Albemarle estate was put at auction by the Lords Albemarle in 1946 at Sotheby's in London. It was bought by Mr. Davies, and he was working at that time for Knoedler and Company, and he was intending to take it back to New York, and in fact had it loaded on board a ship where he met another New York dealer who purchased it from him. So when it docked in New York, the picture belonged to someone else, Mr. Rusak. So I ended up going and doing a lot of research on Mr. Rusak. Who is this man? He wasn't, to me, a well-known person. He dealt in sporting art, who has a gallery at that point called Scott and Fowles. And so all those questions, actually, not even about the picture itself, but about the personalities involved around the picture. Did this help develop the chronology?
Carol's research was incredibly thorough, and it contextualized so many physical pieces of evidence that we observed over the course of the study. There were several objectives to the authentication study, one being that we establish a more complete history of the portrait in our collection, as well as to establish comprehensively the existing condition of the portrait in Paris.
When I first learned about the project and that there was a possibility of analyzing a real Charles Willson Peale portrait of George Washington, I was so excited.
A key aspect of this project has been relationships. We established relationships with a number of institutions that either had versions of the Washington at Princeton portrait in their collection or other known Peale works.
Charles Willson Peale made many copies of his work. Family members made copies of his work. But how close these copies are is the critical question.
Our goal was to develop a baseline of what those paintings should look like and how they were made in order to be able to evaluate the Paris picture and see if it matched.
We started comparing the Paris portrait to the portrait it's based on, which is Charles Willson Peale's 1779 Washington at Princeton. That picture, which is in the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts now, was commissioned by the Pennsylvania Assembly. That was our critical picture.
That painting originally hung in the Pennsylvania State House, which is now known as Independence Hall. Of the Washington at Princeton series, this initial painting hanging in PAFA is the only one that was painted from life.
One of the most special features about the PAFA portrait is the compositional changes we were able to see, which gave us insight into how Peale worked out the composition that we see today. He didn't get it right the first time he painted George standing in the middle of the portrait. Some of the angles were wrong. The hat was in a different location, and I was able to see that using infrared light. And it was really exciting to see something that no one else had seen before, since maybe Peale himself.
After our visit to Philadelphia, the team met in the Washington, D.C. area, and our next visit was to Mount Vernon, where we were able to see their 1780 three-quarter version portrait of Washington at Princeton.
I used my same system that I had developed for the PAFA research I did a condition evaluation. I imaged the painting using visible, ultraviolet, and infrared radiation. And I did elemental analysis with XRF to learn about the pigments that were present. And I also had access to take physical samples from that painting, which turned out to be extremely useful.
What we were looking for was similar materials. We wanted to be able to say, yes, this kind of canvas, this kind of pigment, and we also were allowed to go to the U.S. Senate and see their picture.
The U.S. Senate collection has the second version of the Washington at Princeton portrait hanging at the U.S. Capitol.
I brought my same system and approach to the Senate painting as I did at PAFA and Mount Vernon. Again, I looked at the elemental analysis that I got from the Senate, and I was seeing some distinct similarities. At this point, I had visited a number of Peale paintings and looked very carefully at them and analyzed them, and I had a very good understanding about what one of these paintings should look like and how it would have been made. And it was time to take that body of knowledge to Paris and compare it to the Paris picture.
The looming question as we departed for Paris was whether or not our picture is a Peale.
A couple of days before we went to Paris for the project, Carol Soltis shared with me a photo she had recently uncovered from a 1946 Sotheby's catalog that was the last known picture of the Lawrence Albemarle painting.
Couldn't tell a lot because it was taken in 1946, and it was just not a high resolution kind of image, but it looked compatible.
It looked like an old picture. It looked grainy, it looked like there was dust particles, but there were some things that really stood out to me that looked like features that would only happen to paint. And in particular, I saw a circular shape, and I thought that looks like something called impact crackle. Could just be an optical illusion. But I made a few notes of things that I thought could be part of the paint layer, and I made a diagram, and I thought I'm gonna look at the painting when we get there and see if maybe I can find any of these.
In 2019, I had the opportunity to see the Paris picture hanging in the Louis XVI salon at the residence.
Our Washington at Princeton was put up on the wall in the master's residence when it was loaned and then later bequeathed to us. And we were glad that it was on the wall, but that was basically all the care that was being taken at that time. The Cultural Heritage Program didn't even exist at that time.
My initial impression was that there had been heavy interventions.
The life of the Paris picture gave us pause because of its condition.
When Carol and I walked in there and looked at it, we looked at each other and said, oh, thank God. This thing looks more like the other Peale portraits than we thought it was going to. Then I pull out my diagram and the 1946 picture, and I start looking at the painting, and in particular, I wanted to look for that concentric circles. And I immediately saw it, and it was in exactly the same place. And I thought, we are really onto something here.
The painting was deinstalled. It was taken off of the wall. The dust cover was removed from the back, and that gave us in-person access to the back of the picture. There are a number of labels on the back of the picture, and we were each trying to, take pictures of them and interpret them. Some were in better condition than others. Some were less legible. Some were more legible. And I remember looking down. I was next to Carol. I remember looking down and I said, Scott and Fowles. And she said, Scott and Fowles.
Finding the label for Scott and Fowles Gallery in New York was perfect.
This gallery was E.J. Rusuck's gallery in New York. E.J. Rusuck is the last documented owner of the Lawrence Albemarle portrait. So despite the fact that we don't have definitive documentation of Mrs. Folk's purchase of the painting from Rusuck, we now have this physical evidence that the painting was in his possession.
Finding the label alone answers a major problem. It fills in a gap, and it's really valuable for the provenance research. but it is just as important to have material evidence.
The art historical and technical research are complementary. So even though we had this piece of evidence, the study wasn't complete. Emily still needed to conduct her work.
She's going to give us real science to go together with the more speculative kinds of research that an academic does.
The more I looked at the portrait in person, the more I felt that it was by Peale. That's the truth. But that is nothing more than a feeling, because the work that I do is about material evidence. You must remain objective, no matter how much I want it to be real, because believe me, I wanted it to be real. I needed the evidence. Carol did too. We learned so much about the materials and techniques of Charles Willson Peale. I mean, we have an incredible amount of data that all confirms, along with my opinion and Carol's opinion, that the painting is real. The Paris portrait was painted by Charles Willson Peale.
Okay. Good evening. I'm here to tell you more, if you're ready. Okay. Let's see. All right, before Emily and I each tell you about our respective roles in this project, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to Charles Willson Peale and the type of portrait he was commissioned to paint. Peale was born in Maryland in 1741, and after a humble beginning as a saddler, a group of affluent Maryland gentlemen, aware of his artistic talents, paid for him to travel to London to study painting with Pennsylvania-born artist Benjamin West, who by age 29 in 1767, when Peale arrived in London, had already achieved fame and fortune as a history painter and portraitist. Peale's Maryland patrons, all of whom were strong supporters of colonial rights, wanted large-scale, beautifully painted portraits of themselves and their families in elegant clothing and surroundings. In short, they wanted a colonial American who could paint portraits of them in the European grand manner. In Britain and throughout Europe, ambitious large-scale portraits of the ruling classes and their military heroes was a well-established tradition, and it was a skill Peale mastered by the time he returned from London in 1769. Excuse me. There we go. This was exactly the type of picture the Pennsylvania Assembly wanted when they commissioned Peale to create a portrait to celebrate the American victory over the British at the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, that had been an important turning point in the war. Peale had served at Valley Forge and at Princeton, and the handsome and ambitious picture he created was not only a fine likeness of Washington, whom he had painted twice before, it was also an image that projected mastery and ease by delineating Washington's tall physique with an elegant serpentine line that contemporary British art theory defined as the line of beauty. Peale's portrait was admired by several of the European envoys then in Philadelphia, who were eager to make political alliances with the colonial government against Britain, and this portrait became the model for replicas Charles painted for them to ratify those alliances. The Lawrence, in both its commissioning and its afterlife, the Lawrence Albemarle portrait, through Peale's three close early copies, became a diplomatic political picture. And the Lawrence Albemarle Washington you see here was one of those three original replicas Peale made of his recently completed work. My role was to examine the picture from the perspective of connoisseurship and to see if the way it was painted was characteristic of Peale's work, and most importantly, to undertake research to reconstruct its provenance, since no such documentation had been given to the Department of State by the donor. That is, they didn't know how or why the donor had acquired it. My research, therefore, was focused on tracking the painting's history from when it arrived in the States in 1946 until it was loaned to the Department of State in 1981 for the U.S. Embassy in Paris.
The two key 20th century players who would emerge in reconstructing the life history of this portrait was the New York art dealer Emanuel J. Rusak and his glamorous client, the donor Carolyn Ryan Folk. Through my research, I was able to gain an understanding of who they were and how they would have interacted, which ultimately provided the key to unlocking the picture's previously hidden provenance. Now, these are all items that you saw in the documentary, the 1946 London auction catalog, and how it crossed over to, I don't have a pointer. The next image is the New York Herald Tribune article talking about what happened on board ship, how it changed hands, and how it was at Scott and Fowles Gallery. And then you see the exhibition catalog that Mr. Rusak created in his gallery, Scott and Fowles, for Washington portraiture. And the main picture in that exhibition was the Lawrence Albemarle picture. Then we finally have a connection to the to APS here, in that Charles Coleman Sellers in 1952 documents the picture. Rusak had been in touch with him. I was able to find a letter, correspondence between Rusak and Sellers in the Sellers papers here. And of course, Sellers, as you probably know, was a lineal descendant of Charles Willson Peale, and his research on Peale was exceptional. He did this catalog raisonné, and in it was the Lawrence Albemarle portrait. He had seen it, and the last documentation that we really have for it is from 1952. So that's where the sort of, it's established as Sellers accepting it as a real Peale. He also gives a narrative of the history of the picture. So at that point, Sellers brings it into the literature. And so that was one important thing. However, what happens next is the painting sort of disappears. We know that Rusak merged his gallery with that of Wildenstein. But the Wildenstein archives are not open to research by any public, for people, for scholars, or anything. So there was no way to find a receipt or to track the painting, so it was assumed that it had sort of gone missing. However, what I did was to track Mr. Rusak, and here's what I found out about Mr. Rusak. He was a dealer in what we call British sporting art. He sold important British and American portraits and some landscape pictures, which he acquired on both sides of the Atlantic. He was most focused on selling, however, the 18th and early 19th century sporting pictures. The subjects centered around exemplary specimens of dogs and horses and were sought after by collectors who were also breeders of dogs and horses. Money was no object here, and J. Rusak's clients included Paul Mellon, who once owned this picture you see here, and Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney. And this is the clue to the activities of, of Mr. Rusak. Oops, sorry. Okay. In 1952, the year before the merger of Wildenstein and Rusak, J. Rusak was already deeply engaged in helping Whitney establish the National Racing Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York. The local newspaper quoted Whitney as describing the fledgling museum as, quote, a gallery of paintings, trophies, and the like, many exceedingly rare and of great interest as well as actual value, unquote. It was also noted that a guiding spirit with Mr. Whitney in the creation of the museum was Mr. E.J. Rusak of Scott and Fowles Gallery in New York, who was responsible for the discovery and acquisition of many historic treasures from widely scattered, sometimes hidden sources. In June of 1956, when the museum's completed building opened to the public, Rusak was then described as the noted art consultant with Wildenstein Galleries, who was supervising the hanging of the pictures and placing of the memorabilia. A pamphlet listing the objects in the galleries at that time recorded a George Washington painting by Charles Willson Peale, but no owner was listed, which suggests Rusak still owned it. However, in 1963,
Sorry here. Okay. In 1963, when a larger, more professional catalog was published, also authored by Rusak, the picture appears to have been sold and was recorded as loaned anonymously. And in fact, a label on the back of the Paris picture identifies that picture as an anonymous loan, and you can see that up here on the far side. You can also see his horse. And horses are really becoming the central theme here. In his catalog essay, The Thoroughbred in American Art, Rusak stated that the pictures on display were, quote, limited to American horses, and that the pictures were chosen not for their painters, but for their horses. Who knew that was going to come? The focus on the horse was reinforced in Rusak's text on Peale's picture, which, before giving the portrait's historic Lawrence Albemarle history, he describes Washington as, quote, ardent fox hunter, racing enthusiast, and owner. He raced the good mare Magnolia by Lindsay's Arabian out of an Othello mare from the family of Selima. In his diary in December 9, 1788, Washington records the sale of Magnolia to Colonel Henry Lee of Stratford Plantation for 5,000 acres of Kentucky land, unquote. As we will see, it was likely no coincidence that Rusak chose to reference a horse Washington had raced that he sold to Henry Lee, whose home, Stratford Plantation, had become a historic site in Virginia, since, as I discovered, by 1963, the picture was owned by Carolyn Ryan Folk, who had been an accomplished equestrian, had bred horses herself, and was a generous and dedicated donor to the Lee family's Stratford Hall. This was the kind of historic detail that J. Rusak, who was a dealer known for his astute and careful research, provided his clients. He was undoubtedly pleased to share this fact with Mrs. Folk, but Carolyn Ryan Folk probably was well aware of this anyway. By late last July, before going to Paris, my research had yielded a substantial amount of information on Rusak, including a eulogy written by his friend, the author and literary critic for The New Yorker, Brendan Gill. But questions remained about how he transacted business and interacted with clients. So he was still a bit of an abstraction to me until, by chance, while visiting a friend, I spied a book on her shelf written by Rusak's friend Gill. Hoping it might have some passing mention of Rusak, I pulled it from the shelf and was rewarded with an entire chapter on him that conveyed aspects of his personality and lifestyle that transcended my mere accumulation of facts. In fact, Gill's colorful evocation of Rusak's life was the perfect backdrop for understanding the context in which J. Rusak met his client, Carolyn Ryan Folk. Gill described him as a tall, well-built man who, quote, carried himself superbly and took care to dress like a gentleman. He also noted that he had personal magnetism and a fantastic range of interests, and that, quote, from every side I heard of Rusak's celebrity as a lover that continued to justify itself as he advanced in years. But horses, lovers, whatever. But he was by no means a crude womanizer. He adored women, and it was almost universally the case that the women with whom he had affairs remained friends and confidants long after the affairs were over, unquote. Gill also noted Rusak's many other friends, his profile as a modest yet generous donor to museums, and especially his pride in being a fellow of the Morgan Library. But particularly interesting was Gill's comment that Rusak maintained a, quote, luxurious apartment on Park Avenue, handsomely furnished with splendid sporting paintings on the wall. No doubt the paintings were for sale, unquote. Clearly, this was an indication that Rusak not only sold from Wildenstein's stock, where he was vice president, but also from art he owned privately, like his Washington at Princeton that he had lent to the Racing Museum years earlier.
In this world of art, horses, and high society, it was inevitable that Carolyn Ryan Folk and Jay Rusak would cross paths. And in fact, I learned that Rusak socialized with Mrs. Folk's brother and cousins and had sold sporting pictures to them. The best sources of information about Mrs. Folk's life and interests that I was finally able to locate came from introductory texts in auction catalogs for items from her estate that were published in 1987 and 1992. The latter, a catalog from Christie's, New York, for a, quote, important diamond necklace, unquote, provided significant details about her life, her interests, and her grandfather, Thomas Fortune Ryan, who was described as a, quote, financial baron of the late 19th and early 20th century, whose financial interests ranged from Wall Street and New York City's vast subway systems to banking, insurance, and his role as the largest private owner of Belgian Congo diamond mines. He was a serious collector, and Carolyn spent much of her early life between his New York Fifth Avenue townhouse and his 5,000-acre estate in Oak Ridge, Virginia, which was run as a farm but was complete with a golf course, a race course, and a train station. She later attended the Foxcroft School in nearby Middleburg, Virginia. As the recipient of vast wealth, she maintained a luxurious lifestyle, but also devoted her time and money to philanthropic endeavors. The preface to the 1987 Sotheby's auction catalog that presented 7 important American paintings and watercolors from her collection described her as, quote, a distinguished connoisseur of American paintings and decorative arts, and notes that this collecting took place over a relatively short period of time, beginning in 1947. And most importantly, it noticed that Jay Rusak acted as her advisor, link. Also noted was the fact she traveled widely and frequently, and in 1960 purchased an apartment in Paris. In the mid-1960s, she sold her New York apartment, built a home in Palm Beach, Florida, and put much of her collection into storage. A label from Ollendorf Fine Arts, New York, a firm that stores and transports collections, is another of the labels attached to the back of the stretcher of the Lawrence Albemarle portrait, now in the Paris residence. But the most significant information in this 1987 sale catalog noted the location of her Lawrence Albemarle, Washington, in the context of her loans and donations. It stated that, quote, beyond her personal collection, Mrs. Folk is deeply committed to supporting American art, both in this country and abroad. It also noted her special interests were the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Stratford, Virginia, where she made a substantial donation of furniture, silver, and books, and the American Museum in Britain at Bath. It also noted she had a Charles Willson Peale portrait of George Washington on loan to the American Embassy in Paris. Documents in the archives of historic Stratford Hall Plantation, the ancestral home of the Lee family in Westmoreland County, Virginia, provided additional context and confirmation for the location of Mrs. Folk's portrait of Washington before it was sent to Paris. As an important donor and supporter of Stratford Hall, it was not surprising she had offered them the portrait. Not only was there a connection between Washington and Lee families through marriage, but as she and Jay Rusak knew, Washington had sold Richard Henry Lee his prize horse Magnolia in 1788. But perhaps more importantly, her offer spoke to her desire to find a location that engaged with American history. Lee had been a member of the Second Continental Congress from Virginia and was known for the Lee Resolution, which called for the colony's independence from Great Britain, and therefore was the precursor to the Declaration of Independence. Stratford Hall decided that Carolyn Folk's Washington portrait was too large for proper display in their historic house, but noted it was, quote, too bad to have such an object buried in a warehouse, unquote. In response to their decision, Mrs. Folk replied on January 31st, 1976, that, quote, perhaps later you may consider the Albemarle, Washington, but it would also be appropriate at Monticello, or perhaps the U.S. Embassy in Paris.
Mrs. Folk may have been disappointed in Stratford's decision, but she was thinking ahead to other locations that would provide an appropriate historical context for her portrait. Paperwork forwarded to our project included a photocopy of an undated handwritten note on U.S. Department of State Art and Embassy's program notepaper in regard to the Carolyn Folk estate. It read, "Portrait of George Washington, quote, by Charles Willson Peale, no date for painting, been in program since 1981. Her will states gift to U.S. Department of State and would prefer that it stay in Paris," unquote. This indicates Carolyn Folk had the picture sent to Paris after she settled into a larger townhouse she had purchased near the embassy. This was also consistent with her practice of loaning items before finally gifting them. Mrs. Folk appears to have had a clear understanding of the political, historical role a picture like Peale's Lawrence Albemarle Washington should have going forward. Oops. As a portrait conceived and initially destined to be displayed as a state portrait that celebrated Washington's military role in securing America's identity as a sovereign nation, Mrs. Folk's choice of location for her portrait was well considered. The pictured scale and the general effect of the work in the Paris residence is especially appropriate for its architectural setting, and its subject matter resonates to American history in an era when France lent serious diplomatic support to a fledgling United States. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily MacDonald-Korth, and I am President and Chief Conservator Scientist at Longevity Art Preservation and Western Center for the Conservation of Fine Arts, and I specialize in the scientific analysis of paintings. Along with Carol and her expertise in provenance research and connoisseurship, we recently confirmed the attribution of a Peale in Paris. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for listening. That's it. Okay. I consider the authentication of Charles Willson Peale's portrait of George Washington at Princeton one of my greatest achievements, and I could talk about it for hours. Rather than paraphrase my 150-page report, I'd like to focus on a few key points that will enhance your understanding of the investigation and build upon the great summary covered in the documentary we just watched. In this talk, I will describe my approach to the study and the system I used to compare the paintings involved. I'll start by telling you a bit about my companies and what I do, then I'll briefly explain art authentication. Afterward, I'll show you the other paintings included in the comparative study. I'll explain my scientific approach for system for analysis, what I did with the data I collected, and how I drew my conclusions. I want to underscore the rigor involved in this study. The film makes our work look like magic, but I assure you it was not. It was based on a tremendous amount of information and effort. Before we get into Peale, let me tell you a bit about who I am and what I do. I am a professionally trained painting conservator and a specialist in the scientific analysis of art and architectural finishes. I sometimes refer to my specialty as forensic art conservation because the term helps non-art professionals understand my work. Art conservation is the physical care and study of cultural heritage objects, which includes preservation, scientific research, treatment, and restoration. Forensic science is the application of scientific principles and techniques relating to the collection, examination, and analysis of physical evidence. Forensic art conservation is the union of both. Only a trained forensic art conservator can interpret scientific data and match it to subtle techniques the artist used while also catching clues that might indicate an attribution or a forgery. While I do conservation treatment of paintings and analysis of architectural finishes, most of my work focuses on forensic studies of paintings. I have been hired to analyze paintings by Gilbert Stuart, Warhol, Basquiat, Picasso, Dali, Sam Francis, de Kooning, Monet, and many others. My company, Longevity Art Preservation, has a very capable in-house and mobile scientific analysis lab. I often take my lab into the field, which is how I carried out nearly all the analysis for the Peale project. Longevity carries out technical imaging, portable X-ray fluorescence, also called XRF, macro XRF, polarized light microscopy, cross-sectional optical microscopy, and more. Many of these instruments are also used for biology and crime lab applications. Longevity has labs in Miami, Northern Michigan, and Denver, where we share a space with Longevity's sister company, WCCFA. Bless you. The four major components of art authentication are forensic analysis, art historical data, connoisseurship, and condition assessment. Art authentication is an extremely specialized type of research that must incorporate experts from the fields of art conservation, science, and art history. The work is very complex, and each authentication investigation is unique. Most importantly, authentication is made by consensus, or the group opinion of experts. My services fulfill two of the major components, scientific analysis and condition assessment. On the Peale project, Carol's work was also two parts, art history and connoisseurship. So together, we were the group of experts that are required for an authentication, and our opinions formed the consensus. Scientific or forensic analysis includes imaging, material analysis, and technical studies. Art historical data refers to known data in the literature and is critical for historical correlation and to identify anachronistic art materials. This type of research helps in understanding what techniques to expect for a given artist or period and can then be compared to the results of forensic analysis to help prove or disprove attribution. Philadelphia Museum of Art published the results of analysis of a group of Peale paintings in the 1980s, and I used that data to compare to my findings. However, there was nothing published on the Washington at Princeton series. Provenance is also part of the historical data, and that's what Carol talked about. Provenance refers to the documented history of ownership, and examples of provenance materials, as Carol showed us, are bills of sale, inventory records, photographs, authentication documents, appraisals, conservation records, literature, and countless other possible things. Connoisseurship means expertise in actually looking at paintings by the artist in question, or sometimes their contemporaries. This type of expertise can only come from looking at a lot of properly attributed art. Luckily, Carol is the Peale authority, so we had that part covered. Condition assessment. An object's condition is also crucial, as this is the role of a conservator. If a picture is masked by centuries of discolored varnish or heavy restoration, then the original paint will be obscured. We'll look at examples of this shortly. Likewise, if a painting exhibits a certain condition, it may give instant insight into a restoration or forgery. Only a painting conservator can accurately assess the condition of a painting. Let's look again at the painting in question. The painting, George Washington at Princeton, was attributed to Charles Willson Peale, though it lacked provenance supporting that attribution, as Carol discussed, and the hand of the artist appeared inconsistent with other known Peale paintings from the Princeton series. The painting will also be referred to as the Paris picture. Here we see the front, or recto, and the back, or verso, of the painting. The painting is approximately 8 feet by 5 feet, so it is large. The question posed by the Department of State was, is this painting properly attributed to Charles Willson Peale? Let's start answering that question by taking a closer look at the painting. The painting is rectangular and features General George Washington in a Continental Army uniform of beige pants and vest under a dark blue jacket with yellow metal buttons and complex epaulettes, a cross-body blue sash with highlights giving it the appearance of silk, and knee-high black boots with white metal spurs. Washington is leaning on a cannon, and his right hand holds his hat upside down. The figure stands on bare turf, with Hessian flags in a leaning bundle beneath the cannon on his left, and a British flag lays on the ground to his right. In the middle ground, on the sitter's right, is foliage and 2 American soldiers on horseback. In the middle ground on the sitter's left is a brown horse being held by a groom in a Continental Army uniform with a side view portrait. Flying above the groom and horse is a blue Continental Army flag with a circle of 13 white 6-pointed stars. In the background is a troop of marching Continental and British soldiers, Princeton University buildings, and a large gray sky with some orange and blue areas. The painting is not signed, and no inscriptions are visible on the front or the back. To answer the question about attribution, I developed an analytical system. First, I selected portable, safe, and repeatable methods of analysis. Then I began by examining and analyzing known paintings of George Washington by Charles Willson Peale using the selected methods. Then I repeated the examination and analysis on the Paris picture. After I had all the data collected, I compared the results and determined that the materials and techniques used in the execution of the Paris picture strongly correspond to those in known Peale paintings. Now let's look at the other paintings in the study. Before I could begin analysis, we needed to have more paintings to study. Our State Department colleagues secured access to as many Peale paintings in the Princeton series as they could, which was a remarkable feat. We will be seeing several similar paintings, and to differentiate them, I have included a label at the top of each image. The Paris picture is also referred to as the Laurens. Here are 3 paintings in the study. We see the Laurens on the left, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, or PAFA's picture in the middle. This was the first painting in the Princeton series, and the Senate picture on the right. I also analyzed the 3/4 version of the Princeton painting at Mount Vernon. The White House has an earlier Peale portrait of Washington. We were able to carry out a visual examination in situ in the cabinet room in the east wing of the White House, though no further analysis was carried out. In the top picture up there, you can see the painting hanging on the left. Colonial Williamsburg has another full-size version in the Princeton series, and their conservators generously carried out XRF analysis of the picture per my system and shared the data for the project. I also had the special opportunity to do a condition examination of another full-size Princeton series painting at Versailles in France. No further analysis was carried out on that either. Here are the 7 pictures involved in the study. One of the best ways to carry out attribution research is through comparative analysis. Luckily, I had several to work from. I also want to mention our collaboration with the conservation scientists in the state-of-the-art laboratory beneath the Louvre Museum. We took the Paris picture to the Louvre labs for X-radiography, microscopy, and additional imaging. The staff was very excited to see the painting, and they gathered in the hallway to watch it being unwrapped after delivery. These are the people responsible for works of art like the Mona Lisa, so it was flattering. And to anyone that remembers the part of the Da Vinci Code about the tunnels beneath the Louvre, they are real. I was there, and so was the Paris picture. Methods of analysis for the Peale project consisted of visual inspection, which includes a condition exam, technical imaging under visible UV and infrared radiation, portable XRF, sampling, and cross-sectional optical microscopy. I'll show you examples of most of these techniques and how they help me determine the authenticity of the Paris picture. These yellow rings, I'm sorry, I had a laser pointer earlier and it's not here, but the top left image is a graphic condition diagram, and if you can see the yellow rings, Those are the locations that I mentioned in the film of the impact crackle. So it's not just that one that I found, they're in many locations. Here are 3 details of Washington's face. The Lawrence picture on the left is very different than the others. The technique is unsophisticated when compared to the other 2 done by Peale. However, the paint you see on the Lawrence is not the original paint layer. I recognized that I was looking at a restoration layer, but I needed evidence. On the left is a photograph under visible light, and on the right is ultraviolet radiation. UV allows us to see things that are on the surface of the painting that are otherwise invisible. All the darker fields and islands making this painting on the right appear uneven are restoration. Much of the painting has been retouched, and there was evidence of multiple retouching campaigns. Now we can see the extent of restoration and its location, which helps us understand why the Paris picture doesn't look like the other paintings. Mapping the location of restoration was also crucial in selecting areas for subsequent analysis. Now, on the right is infrared radiation. Infrared allows us to see things that are beneath the surface of the paint that are otherwise invisible. Many things became visible here, including restoration and pentimenti. Now let's look at how I use that information. As I mentioned in the film, I saw many features in both the 1946 image and the Paris picture while doing a visual examination, but I wanted to compare what I could see beneath the paint layer. On the left is the 1946 image of the Lawrence painting. An infrared image of the Paris picture is seen here in the middle, and on the right is a raking light image, which is a mode that enhances surface texture. The red lines indicate visual features in the historic photograph that were also identified on the Paris picture. Finding these extensive correlations indicated that the Paris picture is the same painting that was photographed in 1946, which was the Lawrence painting. This is also a valuable example of how the methods of condition examination and technical imaging work together. Pentimenti, which can often only be seen under infrared imaging, are visual traces of earlier paint locations beneath the final paint layer. Pentimenti is important because it shows that the artist was working out the composition while it was being painted. If the painting was a copy, the composition would have already been defined, and we wouldn't see changes made by the artist during the process of painting. I also found similar pentimenti in other Princeton series paintings. Here are some of the examples of the pentimenti I just described. From the left is Paffa, Sennett, and Lawrence. The locations are marked on the lower row in yellow. The artist had trouble getting the boots in the proper locations. Again, from the left is Paffa, Sennett, and Lawrence. The pentimenti locations are marked, again, on the lower row in yellow. The artist had trouble getting the angle of the shoulder, arm, and hat worked out here. Why is this so important? Because it shows the artist had the exact same issues working out the composition in all 3 paintings. The likelihood of a forger having the same compositional challenges as the artist is exceedingly low. So this is a type of convincing evidence toward the painting being real. XRF is an elemental analysis technique. By determining which elements are present in a tiny location, I was able to infer which pigments were present in compositional components and color groups. From the XRF instrument, I get an XRF spectrum showing all the elements present in the data. From the spectrum, I produce this bar graph to aid interpretation. It'd be helpful if I had a laser pointer, but I'm going to read it, so I hope that you follow along. Mercury, an element represented by the symbol Hg, indicates the presence of vermilion, which is a red pigment. Mercury is noted on the bar graph with a brown hue. The circle just above the word mercury is the brown hue. Starting from the left of the bars, we can see a lot of brown on the bars circled in red. Those bars indicate analysis locations 4, 5, and 6. And on the XRF map, Follow the arrows. Follow the arrow. On the XRF map, we see that locations 4, 5, and 6 are on the red flag. This means part of the red colorant in the flag was vermilion pigment, and we know that Peale used vermilion in his paintings. But there are other things in those locations 4, 5, and 6 too. There's a high proportion of iron, which suggests iron oxide pigments. And there are many other elements here, and inferences. There are many other elements here. All of those little squares of color along the bottom is an individual element. And inferences about colorants can be made from nearly all of them. Other examples of elements listed here are antimony, which suggests Naples yellow, a pigment Peale was known to have used, and zinc in light tones, which suggests zinc white pigment. Zinc white pigment became commercially available in the second quarter of the 19th century, outside the timeline for a Peale painting. And the locations of zinc align with the locations of restoration. So that pigment was a later addition. From this type of detailed analysis, I was able to estimate or determine which paint colors were made from which pigments. I carried out the XRF data analysis slowly and carefully, and I was able to draw conclusions about colorants used on the painting, and several are listed on this slide. Some interesting things that I found were the yellow used on Washington's lapel and pants appears similar. However, the lapel includes Naples yellow and the pants do not. Washington's flesh includes vermilion pigment, while the groom's flesh does not. Vermilion was an expensive pigment, and it may have been reserved for the most important parts of the painting. And I did the same slow and careful process for 5 paintings in total. Equivalent locations were analyzed on each painting whenever possible. Up to 70 locations on each painting in the study were analyzed using portable XRF, which resulted in hundreds of locations, each with approximately 30 data points per location, which gave me over 5,000 data points total from XRF alone. The colorants identified in each location on the Paris picture correspond sometimes identically to the results of analysis of the same location on other paintings in the study. With the evidence I described and much more I didn't have time to discuss, I was able to determine that the Paris picture was indeed by Charles Willson Peale. In the future, I'd like to revisit the chronology of the Princeton series based on compositional changes and analyze more paintings from the Princeton series. Feel free to contact me with questions about the paintings I just discussed or others that you might want to learn more about. Thank you.
Emily and Carol have agreed to answer some questions. We have some folks with microphones. The custom of our people is to raise your hand.
Did it seem that the yellow in one of those portraits was much brighter than the other? On Washington's jacket, it looked to me on, I think, the third one that it was a brighter yellow than the other two.
There were some, can you guys hear me? There were some differences in the saturation of color. Some of it might have been the photographs. Not every photo that I showed, I did. So I had to use photos that were given to me by the institution. So that might explain it. I'm not sure exactly which one you were talking about. But there were, for example, the Mount Vernon painting, the colors were much brighter. Senate also.
Question here, yeah.
That was very enjoyable. How many of those Princeton series paintings are there, and why did he do so many?
Well, you could say they were a cash cow. He did so many because there was a demand. I mean, this was an important picture. It was a political picture. The fact it was used as a diplomatic gift in at least 3 instances that we know of, to France, to Spain, to the Netherlands. is an important fact about it. And of course, anyone on this side of the Atlantic who wanted a Washington image could get a variety of images of Washington by Charles Willson Peale or other members of his family. Replicating art is, of course, something that happened in a time when there was no photography, when if you wanted an image, it was either a graphic image, or if you wanted something punchier, it was going to be an oil painting, and that's why so many were done. And it's, of course, how artists supported themselves. I mean, this was a wonderful thing. If you could paint someone who was notable, like Washington, you immediately had a market for it. And of course, this painting was conceived to celebrate a very important event. So that's the answer, I think, unless there's something else there.
I mean, first off, fascinating from both of you guys. But I was curious, hearing about the white on the later corrections from the early 19th century. Is there any evidence in terms of the provenance about when those corrections from under British hands? In terms of any part of that timeline in the history of the painting?
No, that's very interesting. It's something I thought about a lot because we have the painting being captured. It goes to the Albemarle's home, and of course, it's there for generations. So I would always think, what happened to this poor painting? What child was throwing food against the paintings in some dinner? So we don't know what happened to it then, which is why what Emily was looking at was really such a puzzle to sort of unwind, and you had to sort of drill down very deeply to get that. We don't know. And the painting actually was copied right after the First World War, and the copy was given to 10 Downing Street, but the painting did not actually surface until the 46 auction by the Albemarles, when they, in fact, after World War II, sold almost their entire collection of very important paintings, most of which came back to this side of the Atlantic, paintings of Franklin and all sorts of important people. They also sold their house at that time, their country estate. So it was a function of, paintings change hands as a function of what's going on in the world. So other than that, I can't tell you any details.
The only thing that I'd like to add to that is it's impossible exactly for us to know, other than when that pigment became available. It had to be after a certain time. But as a rule of thumb for important paintings, we estimate that they are treated every generation or before perhaps a big sale. So it might be that it was really glammed up before that last sale.
You can call that glam.
Yeah.
Fascinating detective work. Given the painting's hard life, did you do any restoration?
No, I did not. That's going to be the next phase that the Department of State is going to do. They're actually raising money now to get that conservation project underway.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. Carol, you said Wallenstein wouldn't let you go into the archives, if I understood you correctly.
They're closed to anyone, yeah.
Yeah, they're closed to anyone. Is that typical of the private dealers, that they don't let you into the archive? Why don't they let you into the archive?
It's specific to them, and they don't want their business papers scrutinized by anyone. They have had a number of legal issues over many, many, many decades. It's a very old company. It was established in Paris in 1875. And so it's sort of a traditional thing. So nobody wants to see receipts. You would like that. Ideally, that's what a lot of people who had worked on it previously had been looking for, a receipt for something that says it went from someone to someone. As it turned out, it probably never went to Wallenstein anyway, other than the fact that there was this relationship between Rusak and Wallenstein as becoming a vice president.
The painting, noticeably, the upper torso seems to be out of proportion to the lower part of the body, although that might more reflect my own limitations in reviewing the art. But am I onto something? And if so, is presumably he would have known that when he painted it. So is there some message or reason or purpose in that?
Well, his stomach is, well, as I pointed out at the beginning, it's the serpentine line of beauty, the 18th century beauty line. There is also this fact that having your stomach be perhaps more present than we like to see people's stomachs these days was much more popular in the 18th century. It spoke to affluence. It didn't have a negative ring the way it might. And then the other very simple solution is that Charles Willson Peale was not a fabulous anatomist. He was a wonderful painter and very accomplished in many things, but not always in the rendering of the human form. So you have to look at that painting and look at the gracefulness of it, look at the beauty of the color of it, look at the projection, the actual portrait head of it, and he knew Washington very well. He'd painted him twice by the time he did this, so he painted him 7 times from life, more than any other artist. But that's, yeah, sorry, stomach. Sorry.
Thank you, Emily. This is fascinating. Carol and Emily over here. I'm sorry, yeah. Question for Emily. Is AI used at all in the work that you do? Because I read a lot about it, like on ArtNet News. I'm addicted to that blog. And secondly, have you worked on any kind of repatriation of artwork?
So first part of your question, AI. I don't use AI, but I have a couple of clients that have, after getting my report, have decided to submit images to people that use AI. One was for Basquiat painting, and one was for a Pollock painting. And I'm putting air quotes because I actually determined that neither of them were right. But sometimes my clients are not done, so they decided to try AI. Now, I don't think that I've gotten the results or heard about the results on that Basquiat painting, but the Pollock also, the AI said that the Pollock was wrong. I recently saw an article, maybe you saw it too if you're into this, I think it was in New York Times just the other day, reviewing if AI can determine what else is AI versus human-made, and they featured this AI that looks at Pollocks. And the AI got it right almost all the time, which I'm impressed. So for that, I mean, I was really intrigued after I read that article. I've been keeping tabs on it, but I just so much of what I do, the machines give me information, but I decide what that information really means. And I would never be comfortable with a computer saying, this is what it means, go tell someone. Like, I'm not going to do it. But I think that it's going to get better and better and better. I do. Will it ever be applicable to Peale? I'm not sure. But something really like graphic, which it's about the lines, like Pollock, the splashes and the shapes, I think it could work. The second part of your question was what? I have not been part of that. I've worked at institutions who were part of that. I haven't.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I was just curious about the actual copying of the paintings. Were they done on commission, or did they work on several paintings at a time, or did they anticipate the sales of so many? And the question was asked earlier, but how many do we think there are out there? You mentioned Spain, and have some been lost?
Mm-hmm. No, well, we know that of this particular Washington at Princeton, there were 3 done initially by Peale. And one is in the Senate, one is in a private collection. And the other one is, where's the other one? There are three. One went to France, sorry. One went to France, one went to PAFA, of course, our main picture that we're using as our model. So we do know where those went, and they're all documented, and they're all in cellars. Then what happens after that is there are sort of what you might call subordinate copies. Some of those are done by Charles. Some of them have all sorts of differences, and Sellers goes into that in his catalog raisonné. He says, well, this one doesn't have a hat, or it has a hat, but it doesn't have a cockade on the hat. It has different number of buttons. Perhaps the painting is not full length, but it's still a Princeton because you see Nassau Hall in the back. So there are all kinds of variations of these things. It could make you crazy just going through them, and it is quite something. So people sometimes were commissioned to do different things. Maybe somebody didn't want a full-length Washington. I mean, that takes up a lot of room, as we saw.
Right, like the
you
Mount
need
Vernon.
an embassy for that picture. It's a state picture. If you have a 3/4 length picture, you could put it in your dining room if you have a substantial dining room. So all of these things could be customized, but they also are symbolic objects. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of a painting, how it's used, what it means to different people, and so on and so forth.
There is something I'd like to add to that. So after seeing the compositional changes on multiple pictures, there were less on the Mount Vernon picture than there were on the 3 full-size. I'm wondering if they were painted all at the same time. Now, the Lawrence,
that I showed you, yeah. There's a letter where Charles Willson Peale is talking about having them having canvases on next to one another so that you could see. So there may be some sort of transference of image to image that you could,
I imagine,
get,
I don't know if there was something that I kept talking about with Carol during this, was there a drawing of this painting that he used to copy them, or did he have to have one of the versions in front of him when he painted the copy? How did this work? Because we don't really know. But if he got, let's say, talking again about the compositional changes, let's say he put the hat in this location, a leg at this angle, and a foot there. Then he copied it on the next painting, and then on the next painting, and then said, that's wrong. Go back to all 3 of them and change it. So I think that it means that he must have been working on multiples at the same time.
I think he was working on, in that early example, I'm pretty sure he was working on 2 at a time.
Yeah.
And that one may have lost, and you have a model, and then you have something you can basically replicate. How exactly he did that, he could have traced parts of it and then put it over.
But if it was, he wouldn't have gotten the leg placement wrong. Because tracing was something that they did. You put a piece of paper over it, trace the outline with charcoal.
Yeah, I think it could be a very mixed sort of thing. I mean, you also can measure, you can say the figure is this high, there's this much, and you think the leg is from here to here.
There are differences,
Especially if you're in copying. Copy work is a very different thing, and it can be very tricky, especially for someone like the Peales who are asked to copy something over and over again. Copies usually diminish with time and with the boredom of the artist by replicating the same image. I mean, what is great about life portraiture is that it has that ability to capture something that is real or that, is sparked between the artist and the sitter. And when you copy, you're copying something flat, in many respects. So it's, but the Peales did so much copying, and that was part of their profession, their professional life, that I'm sure they had some sort of systems that we don't quite yet know.
I'm very intrigued in answering that question, though. Very.
We have time for one last question.
Yes, thank you.
2 last questions.
What did George think of the portrait, or was he deceased by the time it appeared?
Oh, no. I think he liked them. I mean, Martha Washington commissioned the first portrait of George Washington before he was doing anything notable. He was just had married her, and she wanted a copy. She wanted a portrait from life. He asked Peale to paint it of George in his uniform from the French and Indian War. And that was a perfectly private portrait. Then the next thing that gets painted is after, in the Revolution, after Boston. And then this becomes the third picture that's painted from life. So the last picture that Peale does of him is as president in 1795. So you have all of these different things. He and Peale were friendly. They had a friendly rapport. I don't know that he ever critiqued any of them. But I don't think he was, I don't know if he liked them or didn't like them, but he liked Charles Willson Peale, so I assume he liked the pictures.
He kept going back, so.
So thank you both. I have a question about the owner, about the owner, Mrs. Folk. I wondered if there's a Philadelphia connection with the Quaker family?
I believe there is. Someone brought this up to me earlier this week when I gave another version of this talk, and apparently there is a connection. That was her third husband, Folk. Her name is Clendenin Ryan. That's her family names. But she kept Mrs. Folk. She was very fond of that. That's how she wished to always be addressed and known, and that's how she is in all legal documents. And yes, there is a connection. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Obviously,